What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. So I've been going back and forth on whether I even want to see two 50-something-year-old boxing and pop culture legends, Iron Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr., fight each other for more than 3 rounds and without headgear. And I've been a lot more back than forth on my opinion on whether it should take place. Why? Not only did I love the personal and well-documented journey that Mike Tyson's been on since he first captured the world's imagination in the late 80s. He's had a multi-generational impact, and for a multitude of reasons. To be honest, most probably didn't think that Mike would make it this long, given the chain of events from the early to mid-90s to late 90s. Things just seem to be spiraling. His last 10 to 15 years, however, have been nothing short of extraordinarily inspirational. Similar public image restoration as another heavyweight legend, actually, George Foreman, but in different ways. Foreman went from this brooding, antisocial, seemingly unhappy guy to like the sunniest, friendliest former athlete imaginable. The George Foreman grill exploded because you could just hear the name and envision a 40-plus-year-old George Foreman at your barbecue. Mike Tyson, however, started showcasing this underrated intellect, a knack for nuance, complexity, philosophy, humility, love, etc. He became increasingly fascinating to the mainstream for reasons totally unrelated to his fight career or his history of violence. Some of it started with his iconic appearance in the comedy The Hangover. He started Tyson Ranch. He's got this hot boxing podcast. Tyson's got it going on. And he actually seems happy. And less than 2 years ago, he was featured on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and attributed much of that newfound happiness on totally distancing himself from the beast that he was and that he needed to be in order to get to where he'd gotten in the fight game. Well, having to dive back into that competitive and very anti-zen, destructive mindset so you could prepare to once again lace up the gloves and put the mouthpiece in and administer pain, it kind of flies in the face of much of that stated purpose, doesn't it? And are any of you guys noticing a change in Tyson's demeanor in recent months? He's kind of cussing out his podcast guest, actor comedian TK Kirkland. He just let Baton Rouge rapper Lil Boozy have it, and his more recent Rogan podcast appearance is a little darker. But hey, this is showbiz and entertainment, and it's an opportunity for a lot of people to make a lot of money, and during otherwise scary economic times. So I won't be the one to advise someone not to capitalize on a huge financial opportunity. I am far from a paper hater, but over the decades, I have grown to really root for Mike Tyson in the game of life. And I'm not sure that returning to combat is conducive to the types of strides he's made over the years. But here we are. Mike Tyson, whose pro career record stands at 50 wins and 6 losses and 2 no contests, is taking on Roy Jones Jr., 66-9. To my knowledge, this is an 8-round fight with 2-minute rounds, which supposedly wasn't the original agreement according to Roy Jones on Rogan's recent podcast. But check it out. Mike Tyson was last in the ring professionally in 2005, where he suffered a pretty uninspired KO loss to Kevin McBride. So the last image we have of Mike in the ring is him literally sitting against the ropes with this look on his face that said it all about how much he had left. And this was 15 years ago. I know he's been working out, and he was looking deadly scary in those first 5-second clips to emerge. When I first saw those clips, I was obviously impressed that he's preserved some of that fierce, powerful, cat-like quickness and explosiveness. But then I thought, well, that's a 5-second clip, and that's Mike working mitts, bags, and shadow boxing. This isn't a moving target. And if you've ever put on the gloves or just have any experience fighting against someone who kind of knows what they're doing, you know that hitting a moving target in the face is not as easy as the people on TV make it look. Also, 5 seconds. Check it out. I can run the pace of a 3 to 4 minute mile time right now for 5 seconds. I mean, can we get a 30-second clip or 2 minutes of intense activity? I mean, the 5 to 10 seconds is riveting. It's super captivating. I mean, Mike Tyson has always had captivating abilities. But those clips told me nothing about how he would perform in an actual boxing fight in 2020. at 54 years old. Look, I'm just as Iron Mike nostalgic as the rest of you, but let's level set, expectations wise. So, Iron Mike was never the same boxer again after he went to prison in 91. He had a lot of wins after that 3-year incarceration. He had some of the biggest fights in boxing history after prison. But he was never again that same focused and disciplined athletic titan who became the youngest heavyweight champ ever versus Trevor Berbick in 86, or the one who knocked out the lineal champ undefeated Michael Spinks in the first round in 88. By the time he fought those 2 fights versus Evander Holyfield in 96 and 97, he was probably at 70 to 80% of his peak self, defensively, stamina-wise, footwork-wise, head movement. All of that had diminished a bit by the mid-90s, and he was probably half of his former self by the time he got stopped by Lennox Lewis in 2002. Then after that, he started getting knocked out by lower caliber opponents like Danny Williams, then finally by Kevin McBride. Now Mike Tyson, at the peak of his powers, has a good shot at beating any heavyweight you could think of, except for maybe George Foreman. Bad matchup. But anyway, this isn't what we're dealing with here, guys. Not only is Tyson 54, but he's also been out of the ring for 8 times as long as Roy Jones Jr. has. From 2015 to 2018, Roy Jones Jr. has fought 8 times. He's actually 7-1 in his last 8, although he's been fighting much lesser quality opponents than he was facing in his heyday. But it's still professional boxing activity nonetheless. Look, I'd love to make this video about Tyson's glory days in the ring, but I can save that for a career retrospective. But if you want my thoughts on this particular fight, then breaking it down using 25 to 35-year-old data, it feels kind of irrelevant. And check it, I get that the majority of people think that Tyson's about to take Roy's head off, partly because we've now seen Roy knocked unconscious a few times, and partly because Mike Tyson is supposedly Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson is going off as a 3.5 to 1 favorite, and I am actually going the other way with my pick. I'm going way the other way with my pick. If Tyson doesn't put Jones out or down in the first round or 2 rounds, I really think that Roy will be able to win rounds from a distance. Now, the scary part of that notion is that Roy Jones' legs were the first thing to decline, even before he started losing fights. During the latter half of Roy's prime, not his career, but the latter half of his prime, he'd spend several minutes of his fights with his back up against the ropes and just fighting off the ropes. Very ill-advised, but he was so gifted that he was able to get away with it. We saw that cost him down the line versus opponents like Glenn Johnson, the first time we had seen him knocked totally unconscious. He got knocked out in his fight just prior to that versus Antonio Tarver in that ill-advised rematch, but he was truly put to sleep versus Glenn Johnson. Jones has to know that that's the one thing that you cannot do versus a 54-year-old who you know is much more likely to connect cleanly on you if you are laying against the ropes. I am not expecting Tyson to be at his best in the middle of the ring. He might throw some punches, but I'd imagine he'll be much more off balance when he lunges than he used to be. His punches will look a lot slower than they used to look, and after the first 45 seconds of each round, I expect Tyson's punch volume to drop tremendously. If Roy is still anywhere near pro boxing shape, he should be able to intelligently navigate the first minute of each round, move around, throw some feints. If Tyson comes in like a bull in a china shop, either move, jab him before he gets off, or hold him. If you lay up against the ropes versus move near the middle of the ring, it's like placing a baseball on the tee and letting you swing at that as opposed to swinging it versus a live pitcher. At his best, Roy Jones Jr. might be the most athletic and mind-blowing boxer I've ever seen. And I haven't seen that Roy since his win against John Ruiz for the WBA heavyweight title back in 2003. He first started looking compromised when he came back down to light heavyweight and fought top contender, rival Antonio Tarver for all of Roy's light heavyweight titles. A fight that Roy won via close decision. We just weren't used to seeing Roy tested and really pushed at all. But the last 15 years of Roy's career were really a mixed bag. You know, up until that knockout loss versus Tarver in the rematch, Roy hadn't truly lost a pro fight. He was disqualified once versus Montel Griffin in 1997 in a fight that he was winning and scored a knockdown. He then obliterated Griffin in the first round of their rematch because that's what happened when you piss Roy Jones Jr. off. In fact, had it not been for Roy's disqualification loss, he might have been 50-0 before losing to Tarver, in which case it would have made more sense to just retire at 50-0. He'd won belts at middle, super middle, light heavy, then came back down to light heavy and defended successfully versus his rival. And he was 49-1 at the time he fought the immediate rematch with Tarver, with that one loss being the DQ to Montel Griffin. In hindsight, that career path would have put him much higher on a lot of these all-time pound-for-pound lists, because Roy sticking around for much too long has damaged that invincibility perception that he carried throughout the 90s and well into the 2000s. But for this matchup, Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr., I'm simply going with the more recently active 51-year-old over the non-active for a decade and a half 54-year-old, even though the 51-year-old is the naturally smaller guy. If Tyson wins this, it'll be because his 54-year-old legs are superior to Roy's 51-year-old legs. Quite frankly, I think that this fight might look pretty sad by the third round, even if the rounds are 2 minutes long. Boxing competitively is exhausting. Hell, hitting the heavy bag for multiple minutes is exhausting. I don't expect these guys to keep up any sort of a serious pace beyond the second round. And if they both become tired and lethargic early, which I expect, who do you think will be banking the slow rounds? Tyson, who relies on explosion and jumping into the pocket, or Roy, who prefers to operate at a distance? If Jones doesn't allow Tyson to muscle him and beat him up in the clinches, he should be able to manage this. So I'll take Roy, but via decision, because I don't expect Roy's attack to be sustained or vicious enough to stop Mike, though I wouldn't be surprised if Roy did stop him. He would really need to want to make a statement for him to press the issue. And this is, on paper, an exhibition. Roy sometimes lets his opponents off the hook once he knows that he's got the fight won, both to mitigate risk, but also probably to show a little bit of mercy. I've seen Tyson do no such favors, not voluntarily at least. But I've got Roy Jones Jr. pulling off the upset via decision. Hats off to both guys for taking this wild ride of a fight. I'm sure that the event will be one hell of a spectacle. But let me know your thoughts on this fight. Is it Iron Mike Tyson all day, or are you taking the smaller man out of these two absolute legends, Roy Jones Jr.? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.